Solve my company's biggest crisis, and $5 million is yours. Richard Cole's voice cut through the glass-walled boardroom like a gavel, sharp and final, the kind of sentence that didn't invite questions, only results. And for a moment, no one moved, not the executives in tailored suits, not the analysts staring at their tablets, not even the city skyline beyond the windows, frozen in the late afternoon light, as if it, too, was waiting for someone brave enough to answer. Because this wasn't just another meeting. This was survival. A billion-dollar tech empire teetering on the edge of collapse, systems failing, investors pulling back, a crisis no one in that room had been able to solve. And yet the challenge now hung in the air, heavy, tempting, dangerous, until a faint sound broke the silence. The soft creak of the door at the back of the room, barely noticeable at first. Just enough to pull a few distracted glances. And there she stood, small against the polished wood and glass, a little black girl no older than 8, her braids neatly tied back, a worn notebook tucked under her arm, her sneakers scuffed like they had walked miles just to reach that doorway. And for a second, no one understood what they were looking at because she didn't belong to this world of quarterly reports and crisis briefings. She didn't match the rhythm of urgency and authority that filled the room. And then the whispers began, quiet, uncertain, edged with disbelief, until one man near the far end let out a short, awkward laugh. Thinking it had to be a mistake, some assistant's child wandering into the wrong room. But she didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't apologize. She just stood there, steady, her eyes scanning the room not with fear, but with something else, something calmer, sharper, as if she had already seen through everything they were struggling to understand. Richard noticed her then, his brow tightening slightly, not in anger, but in confusion, the kind that comes when something doesn't fit into the order of things. And he leaned back in his chair, studying her for a moment before glancing at the others, waiting for someone to step in to correct this interruption, but no one did, because no one quite knew how, and the silence stretched again, thicker now, more uncomfortable, until someone muttered under their breath, "Is this a joke?" And a few quiet chuckles followed, brittle and forced, echoing off the glass walls. But the girl didn't react. She didn't answer. She didn't defend her presence. Instead, she took a single step forward, then another, her small shoes making the faintest sound against the polished floor, a rhythm that seemed louder than it should have been, as if every step carried weight the room wasn't ready for. And still she said nothing, not a word, not even when a senior executive raised an eyebrow and shook his head slightly, dismissive, as if this moment would resolve itself if ignored long enough. But it didn't, because she kept walking straight toward the long conference table where decisions worth millions were made, where reputations were built and destroyed, where no one like her had ever stood before. And something in that quiet, deliberate movement shifted the air, subtle but undeniable, the kind of shift that makes people sit a little straighter, glance at each other a little longer, unsure of why they suddenly felt like they were the ones being watched. And Richard, for the first time since the crisis began, didn't speak, didn't interrupt, didn't control the room. He simply watched, his fingers resting still against the table, as the girl reached the edge of the board, placed her worn notebook down with a soft, deliberate tap, and lifted her gaze to meet his calm, unshaken, as if the $5 million, the collapsing company, the entire weight of that room meant nothing compared to whatever she had already decided to do. The silence did not break all at once. It cracked slowly, like thin ice under pressure, beginning with a low chuckle from the far end of the table, then another, until a ripple of restrained amusement spread across the room, executives exchanging glances that said what no one wanted to say out loud, that this had gone too far, that whatever moment had just unfolded needed to be corrected, contained, dismissed. And one of the senior board members leaned forward, adjusting his glasses with a faint smile that did not reach his eyes, saying carefully, "This is a restricted meeting," his tone polite but edged with authority, the kind that expected immediate compliance. But the girl did not respond. She did not even look at him. Her attention remained fixed on Richard Cole, as if he were the only person in the room worth acknowledging. And that alone shifted something subtle but undeniable, because people like Richard were used to being the center of attention, not the subject of quiet evaluation. And for a brief second, he felt it, that unfamiliar sensation of being studied rather than being in control, and he exhaled slowly, leaning back in his chair, his voice calm, but carrying the weight of command. "Let her speak," he said, though she had not spoken at all. And that contradiction lingered in the air, confusing, disarming, until another voice cut in, sharper this time. "Richard, this is not appropriate." But he raised a hand without looking, silencing the objection instantly, his gaze still locked on the girl, curiosity beginning to replace irritation, because something about her composure did not match the situation. Children hesitated. Children explained themselves. Children sought permission, but she did none of those things. Instead, she opened her notebook slowly, revealing pages filled with tight, careful handwriting, numbers, symbols, diagrams that did not belong to a child's world. And for the first time, a few of the smiles around the table faded, replaced by something more cautious, more attentive, as she turned the notebook toward the table, not presenting it dramatically, not demanding attention, simply placing it there as if the evidence could speak for itself. And then, without a word, she reached toward the conference system, her small hand hovering for a fraction of a second before pressing a single key, and a massive screen at the end of the room flickered, the company's internal dashboard appearing, the same one the entire board had been staring at for days without answers, and a quiet tension tightened across the room. Because now she was not just present, she was interacting, crossing a line no one had invited her to cross, and yet no one stopped her. Not even Richard, whose eyes narrowed slightly as he watched her movements, precise, deliberate, as if she had done this before, as if she understood the system in a way that made the chaos they were facing seem almost simple. And a voice near the middle of the table spoke again, less confident this time. Who let her access that? But the question hung unanswered, because the real question was no longer how she got there, but what she was about to do. And the room grew quieter, heavier, the earlier laughter gone completely now, replaced by a stillness that felt different from before. Not confusion, not dismissal, but anticipation, because the girl who had said nothing was now the only person moving, the only person acting, and as her fingers moved across the interface, bringing up a series of hidden logs that had not appeared in any official report. Richard leaned forward slightly, his voice lower now, more focused. "What are you looking at?" And for the first time, she spoke, her voice soft but clear, steady in a way that carried across the room without force. "Something you missed," and the words did not sound like an accusation. They sounded like a fact, simple, undeniable. And in that moment, the power in the room shifted again, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough for everyone to feel it. Because the $5 million challenge was no longer just a statement. It was about to become a test, and no one in that room was sure they were ready for the answer. The word hung in the air longer than it should have. Something you missed, simple, quiet, but it landed heavier than any presentation that had filled that room in the past week. And for a moment, no one spoke, not because they agreed, but because they did not know how to respond without exposing just how little they actually understood about the crisis unfolding in front of them. And Richard Cole felt it first. That subtle tightening in his chest, not fear, not yet, but recognition, the kind that comes when control begins to slip in ways you cannot immediately explain. And he leaned forward further, his elbows resting on the table now, his attention no longer divided between people and screens, but fully locked onto the girl as she moved through the system with quiet precision, pulling up layers of data that had been buried beneath polished summaries and filtered reports. Her fingers pausing briefly before selecting a sequence that caused the screen to shift again, this time revealing a pattern that had not been visible before, a string of timestamps, transactions, and internal flags that seemed unrelated at first glance, scattered across departments, across days, across systems that were never meant to intersect. And one of the analysts frowned, leaning closer to his own tablet, as if trying to verify what he was seeing, his voice hesitant now, stripped of earlier confidence. "That is not possible. Those logs are isolated." But the girl did not look at him. She only tapped once more, aligning the data into a single timeline, and suddenly the scattered pieces began to form something else, something intentional, something designed, and a low murmur spread across the table. Not disbelief this time, but unease, because what they were looking at was no longer a malfunction. It was a pattern, and patterns meant purpose. And purpose meant someone had been guiding this from the inside. And Richard's expression changed, almost imperceptibly, but enough for those closest to him to notice, his jaw tightening slightly, his eyes narrowing not at the girl, but at the screen, as if it had just revealed a version of his company he had never seen before. And he spoke again, slower this time, more measured. Explain it, he said, not as a command, but as a request, and the shift in tone did not go unnoticed, because people like Richard Cole did not ask for explanations. They demanded them. But now he was listening, and the girl finally lifted her hand from the controls, her voice steady, unhurried. It is not a system failure, she said, her words clear and evenly spaced. It is a sequence, and she pointed to the screen, not dramatically, not accusingly, simply indicating what was already there. Every time the system corrected itself, someone pushed it back, and the room seemed to shrink around that sentence, the air tightening as if it had been pulled inward, because now the crisis had a different shape, a different weight, and one of the executives shifted in his seat, his fingers tapping nervously against the table. That would require internal access, he said quickly, as if stating it fast enough would make it less real, but the girl nodded slightly, as if confirming something she had already known. Yes, she said, and then, after a brief pause that felt longer than it was, she added, someone here, and the silence that followed was not empty. It was charged, heavy with implication, as eyes began to move, not toward the screen, but toward each other, subtle, cautious, calculating, because the room that had once felt united in solving a problem was now divided by a possibility no one wanted to face. And Richard slowly sat back, his gaze sweeping across the table, not searching for answers anymore, but searching for reactions, for hesitation, for anything that did not align with what he thought he knew. And for the first time since the meeting began, the crisis was no longer just about numbers or systems or losses. It was about trust, and that was something far more difficult to repair. And at the center of it all stood a girl who had said almost nothing, yet had shifted everything. No one moved at first, not because they were frozen, but because they were thinking, calculating, replaying the last few minutes in their heads, trying to understand how a room full of seasoned executives had been led here by a child who had barely spoken. And the tension shifted again, sharper now, more personal, because suspicion had entered the space, quiet but undeniable. And once it did, it changed everything. And one of the board members leaned back slowly, crossing his arms as if to create distance from the screen, from the accusation, from the possibility that this was no longer just a technical issue. His voice controlled but edged with defensiveness. That is a serious claim, he said, not looking at the girl, but at Richard, as if appealing to authority could restore order. But Richard did not answer him. His attention remained on the data, on the pattern that now stretched across the screen like a thread connecting decisions, actions, and outcomes that should never have aligned. And the girl did not rush. She did not repeat herself. Instead, she reached forward again, scrolling through the timeline with steady movements, isolating specific points, highlighting moments where the system had corrected itself only to be pushed back in a failure. Each instance subtle on its own, almost invisible, but together forming something deliberate, something designed to look accidental. And she spoke again, her voice still calm, still measured. It happens every 48 hours, she said, and the precision of the number landed with weight, because that was not random, that was scheduled, intentional. And one of the analysts blinked, quickly pulling up his own records, his fingers moving faster now, urgency replacing skepticism. She is right, he said quietly, almost to himself, and the confirmation rippled through the room like a low current, shifting attention, shifting belief. And suddenly the earlier laughter felt distant, misplaced, and Richard straightened slightly, his voice cutting through the tension, not loud, but firm. Show me who has access to these intervals, he said, and this time it was not directed at his team, It was directed at her, and she nodded once, as if she had been waiting for that question, as if the answer had already been prepared, and with a few more inputs, the system filtered again, narrowing down the access logs, eliminating layers of authorization, until only a handful of names remained, displayed clearly on the screen, and the room leaned in collectively, not physically but mentally, every person present drawn toward that list, because now the crisis had a face, or at least it was about to, and one of the names triggered a subtle reaction, a shift in posture, a brief hesitation that lasted less than a second. But in a room this tense, even a second was enough, and Richard saw it. Not the name first, but the reaction, his eyes moving. From a screen to the man seated 3 chairs to his left, a senior executive who had been quiet for most of the meeting, too quiet, and the girl followed that same line of sight, not because she was guessing, but because she had already connected the pattern, and she did not point immediately. She did not accuse. She simply brought up one final layer of data, a sequence of internal approvals tied to the same intervals, the same disruptions, and then she stepped back slightly, giving the screen the space to speak, and in that moment, the room held its breath again, not in confusion this time, but in realization, because the evidence did not need interpretation. It was clear, structured, undeniable, and Richard's voice came next, low, steady, but carrying something new, something heavier than authority. "Explain this," he said, not to the girl, but to the man whose name now sat at the center of everything. And the shift was complete, because the challenge that had begun as a test of skill had become something else entirely, a test of truth. And, at the center of it all, the girl who had walked in without a word had not just found the answer, she had changed the question. The man did not answer right away, and that silence said more than any denial ever could, because in a room built on confidence, hesitation was the loudest signal of all, and the executives who had once sat comfortably in their authority now shifted in their seats, eyes flicking between the screen and the man whose name had just been pulled into the center of the crisis. And he cleared his throat, adjusting his tie with a practiced motion that had carried him through years of negotiations and boardroom decisions. But this time the gesture felt different, slower, heavier, as if it no longer held the same control. And his voice came out measured, careful. "There must be a mistake," he said, not loudly, not aggressively, but with the kind of restraint that hoped reason alone could dissolve what had just been revealed. And a few heads nodded instinctively, not in agreement, but in habit, because doubt was easier than acceptance. And Richard did not interrupt. He did not challenge the statement immediately. Instead, he watched, his gaze steady, his silence deliberate, giving the moment space to unfold. Because he understood something now that he had not understood before, that the truth, once visible, did not need to be forced. It only needed to be seen clearly enough, and the girl remained where she stood, slightly back from the table, her hands resting lightly at her sides, her notebook still open but untouched, as if everything that needed to be said had already been placed in front of them. And she spoke again, her voice quiet but precise. "It is not a mistake," she said, and she reached forward one more time, bringing up a final layer of data, not new information, but a connection, a simple line linking access times, system overrides, and approval codes, all tied to a single user profile. And this time, there was no pattern to interpret, no ambiguity to question. It was direct, undeniable, and the room reacted differently now, not with whispers, but with stillness, the kind that settles when everyone reaches the same conclusion at the same time. And the man's expression tightened, just for a second, before he straightened his posture again, trying to reclaim the ground that had shifted beneath him. "Those logs can be manipulated," he said, more firmly now, leaning slightly forward as if asserting control through proximity, but his words did not carry the same weight they had earlier because the confidence behind them had thinned. And one of the analysts spoke up again, this time without hesitation. "Not like this," he said, shaking his head as he compared the data on his own screen. "This would require access across multiple secured layers, approvals that cannot be faked without leaving a trace." And he glanced at the girl briefly, not dismissively, but with a new kind of respect, as if acknowledging that she had seen something he had overlooked. And Richard finally moved, slowly standing from his chair, the quiet authority of his presence filling the room without the need for raised volume or sharp commands. And when he spoke, his voice was calm, but it carried finality. "Then we are not dealing with a system failure," he said, his eyes returning to the man. "We are dealing with a decision." And the distinction landed heavily, because a failure could be fixed, but a decision had intent, and intent changed everything. And the man opened his mouth as if to respond, to argue, to explain, but the words did not come as easily now, because the room had already shifted, already moved past doubt into recognition, and the girl watched quietly, her expression unchanged, not triumphant, not emotional, simply steady, as if this outcome had always been inevitable. And Richard turned his attention back to her for a brief moment, his voice softer now, but no less significant. "How did you see it?" he asked, not as a test, but as a genuine question, and she met his gaze without hesitation, her answer simple, almost understated, because it did not look like a problem. She said, "It looked like someone hiding," and the words settled into the room with a quiet weight, reframing everything they've been trying to solve, because the crisis was never just about systems or numbers. It was about what had been concealed in plain sight, and now it was no longer hidden. No one challenged her after that. Not immediately, because her words had shifted something deeper than the data ever could, and the room sat in a fragile balance between denial and acceptance, where every second stretched just enough for doubt to try one last time to survive. But it was already fading, and Richard Cole understood that before anyone else spoke, he stepped away from the table slowly, not in retreat, but in decision. His presence moving from observer to authority again, though different now, quieter, more deliberate, and he turned toward the man whose name still lingered on the screen, his voice steady. "We will review every access point, every approval, every override," he said, not as a threat, but as a conclusion, and the finality in his tone left no room for negotiation, and the man's composure faltered just slightly, not enough to collapse, but enough to be seen, his eyes flicking briefly to the exits, to the others, to anything that might shift the direction of what had just begun. But nothing did, because the room had already moved forward, and one by one, the other executives began to lean into their screens, not to defend, but to verify, to confirm what they now knew they could no longer ignore, and the quiet clicks of keyboards filled the space, replacing the earlier silence with a different kind of tension, one built on realization instead of disbelief, and the girl stood still through it. All, her role complete in the simplest way possible. She had not argued. She had not convinced. She had only shown. And now the truth was doing the rest. And Richard turned back toward her again, his expression no longer guarded, no longer distant, but thoughtful, as if he were looking at something he had not expected to find. And he asked again, more softly this time, "Where did you learn to see like that?" And the question carried something new, not authority, not challenge, but respect. And she considered it for a moment, not searching for an answer, but choosing one. And then she said, "When people do not listen, you watch." And the simplicity of it landed deeper than any explanation could have, because it revealed something the room had overlooked long before the crisis ever began, that attention was not about power, it was about presence, and presence had been missing. And one of the analysts looked up from his screen, his voice quieter now, but certain. "The pattern continues. Back at least 6 months," he said, and that shifted the weight again, because this was not recent, this was not sudden, it had been building carefully, quietly beneath their decisions, beneath their confidence. And Richard nodded once, absorbing it, not reacting, not rushing, because he understood that this moment required clarity more than speed. And he walked back to his chair, but did not sit, instead resting his hand lightly against the back of it, grounding himself in the reality that had just been revealed. And then he spoke to the room, not loudly, but with a clarity that cut through everything else. "We fixed the system," he said, pausing just long enough for the words to settle. "But first we fixed what allowed this to happen," and the distinction mattered, because for the first time, the crisis was no longer just external, it was internal, structural, human, and the room understood that, not through explanation, but through the quiet shift in how everyone now held themselves, more aware, more careful, more honest. And in the middle of it all, the girl reached for her notebook again, closing it gently, as if the work she came to do had been completed, and she stepped back from the table, not waiting for acknowledgement, not expecting reward, just moving toward the door the same way she had entered, quietly, without announcement. And Richard noticed his voice stopping her just before she reached it. "Wait," he said, not as a command, but as a recognition. And when she turned, he looked at her for a moment, not as a stranger, not as a child out of place, but as someone who had changed the course of everything in that room. And he said, "You solved it." And for the first time, a faint shift touched her expression, not pride, not surprise, just a quiet understanding, as if she already knew that solving it had never been the hardest part, seeing it had been. The room did not return to normal after that, because normal no longer existed in the same way. And even as the executives resumed their work, verifying logs, cross-checking access, confirming what had already become undeniable, something quieter lingered beneath it all, a shift not just in what they saw, but in how they saw. And Richard Cole stood there for a moment longer than necessary, watching the girl who had already begun to leave, her small hand resting briefly on the door handle, her posture unchanged, calm, steady, as if she were stepping out of a place that had never truly belonged to her, and yet had been changed because she had entered it. And he moved forward a single step, not to stop her, but to understand something he could not ignore. "You said you learned to watch," he said, his voice lower now, more personal, and she paused, turning back just enough to meet his gaze again, not hesitant, not rushed, simply present. And he continued, "What made you start?" And the question did not sound like a test anymore. It sounded like someone searching for a missing piece. And she looked at him for a moment, not as a CEO, not as a powerful man, but as someone asking honestly. And she answered in the same tone she had used all along, quiet, clear, because no one noticed when things changed, she said, and the words settled gently, but they carried weight because they did not just explain her, they explained the room, the company, the crisis itself. And Richard felt that realization more than he showed, a subtle shift in his expression, a brief tightening in his jaw, as if the truth had reached further than he expected. And behind him, the analyst continued working. Voices now focused, urgent, but different, no longer defensive, no longer dismissive. And one of them spoke up again, calling out without looking away from his screen. "We can isolate the override path now," he said. "If we shut down access at the root, we can stabilize the system within the hour." And that changed the energy again, because now there was a path forward, not just a problem exposed, but a solution within reach. And Richard nodded slightly, absorbing the update, but his attention returned to the girl, because he understood something else now, that the solution had not come from the system. It had come from perspective, and that was harder to replicate, harder to teach. And he said more firmly this time, "Stay," and the word carried a different kind of weight, not authority, but invitation. And the room noticed it, subtle but clear, the shift in how he spoke to her, how he saw her. And she did not answer immediately. She looked at the table, at the screen, at the people who had once laughed, who now worked with a quiet urgency shaped by what she had revealed. And then she looked back at him, her expression thoughtful, not uncertain, but considering, and she asked a simple question, "Why?" And the word was not defiant, it was genuine. And it stopped him for a second, because it required an answer that could not be built on power alone. And he did not rush it. He did not fill the silence with something easy. Instead, he answered with the same honesty she had shown. "Because you see what we do not," he said. And the admission was quiet, but it carried more meaning than any formal acknowledgement ever could, and the room felt it, not as a statement, but as a shift in understanding. And she held his gaze for a moment longer, as if weighing the truth of his words. And then she stepped away from the door, not fully returning to the table, but not leaving either, standing in that space between, where choice existed, where the next step was not defined by expectation, but by decision. And for the first time since she had entered the room, the question was no longer what she could do, it was what she would choose to do next. The question lingered between them, quiet but powerful, not demanding an answer, but inviting one, and Ava Johnson did not rush to fill the space, because she had already learned that silence was not emptiness. It was clarity waiting to form, and she looked around the room once more, not at the people, but at what had changed within them, the way their posture had shifted from dismissal to attention, the way their voices now carried focus instead of doubt, and she saw something familiar in that. Transformation, something she had seen before in smaller places, in quieter moments, when someone finally chose to look instead of assume, and she stepped forward again, not fully returning to the table, but closer than before, her presence no longer out of place because the room itself had moved to meet her, and Richard watched that movement carefully, recognizing that what was happening now was not about authority, but about alignment, about two perspectives finding a common ground that had not existed before. And he spoke again, this time not to her alone, but to the room, locked down the override access immediately, he said, his tone steady, grounded in decision. No exceptions, no delays. And the response came quickly, not with hesitation, but with action. Hands moving, commands issued, confirmations exchanged, and within moments the system began to shift, the instability that had plagued them for days starting to settle, not fully resolved, but contained, controlled. And one of the analysts looked up, a hint of disbelief still in his voice. The error rate is dropping, he said, and another followed. Stabilization is holding, and the room exhaled, not loudly, not dramatically, but collectively, as if a weight had been lifted just enough to allow clarity to return, and Richard nodded once, absorbing the progress. But his focus returned again to Ava, because he understood something deeper now, that the solution they had implemented was not the real breakthrough. The real breakthrough had been the moment she chose to step forward, to act when no one else could see clearly enough to do so. And he stepped closer to her, not imposing, not towering, but meeting her at a level that felt intentional. And he said, "The $5 million, his voice calm, but carrying significance. It is yours." And the words landed differently than they had at the beginning of the meeting. No longer a challenge, no longer a distant reward, but a recognition of something already proven. And the room grew quiet again, not in tension, but in anticipation, because this was the moment where outcomes were defined, where effort translated into result. And Ava looked at him, her expression unchanged, not surprised, not excited, simply thoughtful. And she glanced briefly at the screen, at the system now stabilizing, at the people who had once overlooked what she saw. And then she looked back at him and asked, "What would I do with it?" And the question shifted the air again, subtle but profound, because it was not rejection, it was perspective. And Richard paused, not because he did not have an answer, but because he realized that his answer might not be the one that mattered. And he said, carefully, "Anything you want." And she considered that, not as a possibility, but as a concept. And then she shook her head slightly, not in refusal, but in understanding. "I do not need it," she said, her voice soft but certain, and the room felt that, not as a dismissal of value, but as a redefinition of it. And one of the executives shifted in his seat, as if trying to reconcile what he had just heard, because in their world, $5 million was never something to turn away from. But Ava did not explain further. She did not justify her answer. She simply stood there, steady, as if the decision had already been made long before she walked into that room. And Richard studied her for a moment, not confused, not frustrated, but thoughtful, as if he were seeing a different kind of measure, a different kind of worth. And for the first time, the reward felt smaller than the act that had earned it. The room did not react the way it had before. There was no laughter now, no quiet disbelief, only a stillness that carried something deeper, something reflective, as Ava Johnson's words settled into the space. "I do not need it." And for a moment, no one spoke, not because they disagreed, but because they were trying to understand what it meant to refuse something they had spent their entire careers chasing. And Richard Cole stood there, studying her, not with confusion, but with a kind of recognition that had been building since the moment she walked through the door, because he had seen ambition in many forms, loud, aggressive, relentless. But this was different. This was clarity, and clarity did not need validation. And he nodded slowly, not as a concession, but as an acknowledgement. Then tell me what you do need, he said, his voice steady, open, and the question carried weight. Because it was no longer about a reward. It was about value, about purpose, and Ava looked at him. For a moment, not searching for the right answer, but deciding whether the answer mattered. And then she glanced toward the screen again, where the system continued to stabilize, the error rates dropping, the patterns no longer repeating, and she said, "Fix it so it does not happen again." And the simplicity of the request landed with a quiet force because it redirected everything, from compensation to responsibility, from transaction to transformation. And one of the executives shifted, slightly, as if the weight of that statement had reached him personally, and another lowered his gaze to the table, not out of shame, but out of reflection, because they all understood now that the crisis had not just been technical. It had been allowed, overlooked, missed in ways that extended beyond code and systems. And Richard exhaled slowly, absorbing her words, not as advice, but as a standard, and he said, more firmly now, "We will," and this time, the promise did not sound like a corporate assurance. It sounded like a decision that would carry forward beyond the room, beyond the moment. And Ava nodded once, not as approval, but as acknowledgement, as if that was all she had come to hear. And she reached for her notebook again, holding it lightly at her side, preparing to leave once more. But before she could turn, one of the analysts spoke up, his voice hesitant but sincere. "How did you know where to look?" And the question was different from the others, not directed at authority, not seeking control, but seeking understanding. And Ava paused, considering him for a moment, and then she said, "Because everyone else was looking where they were told to look," and the answer settled into the room like a quiet truth, because it revealed something deeper than the crisis itself, that sometimes the problem was not hidden. It was simply outside the boundaries people chose not to cross, and the analyst nodded. Slowly, not fully understanding yet, but recognizing the meaning behind it. And Richard watched that exchange carefully because he saw in it something rare, not just a solution, but a shift in thinking. And he stepped closer again, his voice softer now, but no less intentional. "You could stay here," he said, not offering a position, not defining a role, but opening a possibility. "Learn, build, be part of this." And the offer was not about control. It was about connection, about bringing that clarity into a space that had lacked it. And Ava looked at him again, her expression thoughtful. And she asked, "Would you listen?" And the question stopped him for a moment, not because it was difficult, but because it was honest. And honesty required more than agreement. It required change. And he answered without hesitation, "Yes." And this time, the word carried weight, not just as a response, but as a commitment. And Ava studied him for a brief second longer, as if measuring the truth behind it. And then she gave a small nod, not as acceptance, not yet, but as something closer to consideration, because for the first time, the decision in front of her was not about solving a problem. It was about choosing where her voice would be heard next. The answer lingered between them, not just as a word, but as a commitment that reshaped the air in the room. And Ava Johnson did not look away immediately, because she had learned that promises were easy to say but harder to recognize as real. And she studied Richard Cole for a moment longer, not searching for perfection, but for consistency, for something that would not disappear once the moment passed. And behind him, the boardroom continued to shift, quieter now, more focused, as the analyst confirmed stabilization across multiple systems. Voices low but steady. Error rate is down to under 2%, one said, and another followed. Recovery is holding across all regions, and the numbers mattered. They always had, but for the first time they were not the center of attention. They were the result of something else, something that had started with a single step into a room that was not ready to listen. And Richard turned slightly, acknowledging the updates with a brief nod. But his attention returned to Ava almost immediately, because he understood that what stood in front of him was not just someone who had solved a crisis. It was someone who had revealed a gap in how that crisis had been approached in the first place. And he said, more carefully now, "If you stay, it will not be as a guest," his voice steady, grounded in intention. "It will be as someone we learn from." And the phrasing mattered because it reversed the expectation. It placed value not on what she would receive, but on what she already carried. And The room felt that shift, subtle but clear, as a few of the executives exchanged glances, not questioning, but adjusting, recalibrating how they saw the situation, and Ava listened without interruption, her expression thoughtful. And she took a small step closer to the table, not fully joining, but no longer standing apart, and she asked, "Then you will change how you look?" And the question was not about systems, not about data. It was about perspective, about whether the lesson she had shown would be remembered beyond this moment. And Richard did not hesitate this time, because hesitation had already cost him more than he realized. "Yes," he said, and the word carried more weight now, reinforced by what had just happened, by what he had seen unfold in front of him. And Ava nodded once, as if that answer was enough for now. And she looked toward the screen again, where the system had stabilized almost completely, the patterns no longer repeating, the structure holding, and she said quietly, "Then it will work." And the simplicity of her statement carried confidence, not in the system itself, but in the shift behind it. And one of the analysts let out a small breath he had been holding, leaning back slightly in his chair. "It is holding steady," he confirmed, and the room absorbed that, not with celebration, but with a quiet understanding of how close they had been to something far worse. And Richard finally allowed himself to sit, not in relief, but in reflection, his posture different now, less rigid, more grounded, as if the weight he carried had changed shape. And he looked at Ava again, not as someone outside the room, but as someone who had redefined it. And he said, "What is your name?" And the question, simple as it was, marked a shift that should have happened much earlier. And she answered without hesitation, "Ava Johnson." Her voice calm, steady, and he repeated it once, not loudly, but clearly enough for the room to hear, "Ava Johnson," as if placing it where it belonged, within the space that had once overlooked her. And a quiet acknowledgement moved through the room, not spoken but felt, as the people present began to understand that this moment would not be measured only by the crisis that had been solved, but by the way it had been solved, by who had seen what others did not. And Ava stood there for a moment longer, her notebook still in hand, her presence now fully part of the room, and the choice in front of her no longer felt like an interruption, but like a beginning, not defined by the $5 million she had declined, but by something far more valuable, a place where seeing differently was no longer ignored but needed. The name settled into the room like a quiet anchor, Ava Johnson. No longer just a presence, no longer just a moment, but something real, something recognized, and the shift that followed was subtle yet undeniable, because once a name is spoken with intention, it changes how people see you, how they remember you, and how they choose to listen. And for the first time since she had walked through the door, the room was not reacting to her, it was adjusting around her. And Richard Cole remained seated, his posture steady, his gaze thoughtful, as if he were recalibrating not just the situation, but himself within it. And he said, not loudly, but clearly enough for everyone to hear, "Document everything we found today." His tone measured, focused, not just the failure, but how we missed it. And that distinction mattered because it shifted the narrative from correction to accountability. And the analysts responded immediately, their movements more deliberate now, no longer just solving, but understanding. And one of them spoke up, his voice carrying a different kind of awareness. "We filtered too aggressively," he said, almost to himself. "We trusted the summaries instead of the raw data." And another added, "We assumed the system would flag anything critical." And the realization spread, not as blame, but as clarity, because the oversight had not been hidden. It had been overlooked. And Ava listened quietly, her eyes moving across the room, observing the change she had set in motion. And she did not interrupt, because she understood that this part mattered too, the moment when people begin to see their own patterns, not through instruction, but through recognition. And Richard nodded once, acknowledging the insight. And then he looked at her again, his voice softer now, but grounded. "You changed how we see this," he said. And the statement was not exaggerated, it was precise. And Ava held his gaze for a moment, not absorbing praise, but measuring truth. And she responded simply, "You changed it." And the words redirected the weight, because they made it clear that seeing was only the first step. Choosing to act was the real shift. And that landed differently, because it placed responsibility back where it belonged, and Richard understood that. A faint exhale leaving him as he nodded again, this time more slowly, as if accepting something. Larger than the moment itself, and behind them, the system reports continued to update, stability confirmed across every monitor channel. The crisis no longer expanding, no longer threatening to spiral, and one of the executives who had earlier questioned her presence spoke now with a tone that carried a different kind of respect. "We would not have caught this today," he admitted, not looking at her directly, but not avoiding it either, and the admission did not weaken him. It strengthened the room, because it allowed the truth to exist without resistance. And Ava did not respond, not because she dismissed it, but because she did not need to. The acknowledgement was enough, and Richard stood again, this time not out of tension, but out of purpose, his voice steady as he addressed the room. "This does not end here," he said. "We do not just fix what broke. We change how we operate." And the words carried forward, not as a directive, but as a commitment. And the room understood that, not as an instruction, but as a new standard, and Ava stepped slightly to the side, no longer at the center, but not outside of it either. Her presence integrated into the space in a way that felt natural now. And Richard turned back to her once more, his expression thoughtful, almost reflective, and he said, "You asked if we would listen," pausing just long enough to let the memory of that question settle. "We will." And this time, the promise did. Not stand alone, it stood on everything that had just happened. And Ava gave a small nod, not as agreement, but as acknowledgement, as if marking the moment quietly, and she glanced once more at the room, at the people who now saw differently. And for the first time, it was not just a place she had entered, it was a place that had changed enough to meet her where she stood. The room did not feel the same anymore. Not because the crisis had ended, but because something deeper had shifted beneath it, something that could not be undone once it had been seen. And Ava Johnson stood quietly at the edge of the table, her presence no longer an interruption, but a reference point, a reminder of what had been missed and what could no longer be ignored. And the executives continued their work with a different kind of focus, their voices lower, their movements more deliberate, as if each action now carried an awareness it had lacked before. And Richard Cole watched it all unfold, not as a man regaining control, but as someone redefining it, his gaze moving from the screens to the people, from the data to the decisions that shaped it. And he spoke again, not loudly, but with clarity that held the room. "We build a system that questions itself," he said, his words measured, intentional, not just one that reports what it is told. And the idea landed differently than any directive before, because it was not about fixing a flaw, it was about changing a mindset. And one of the senior analysts nodded slowly, already adjusting his approach. "We can restructure the alert thresholds," he said, "but we will also need independent review layers." And another added, "and access logs that cannot be filtered without full trace visibility." And the conversation that followed was not reactive. It was constructive, shaped by what had been revealed rather than what had been assumed. And Ava listened, her eyes moving across the room, not searching for errors now, but observing how understanding began to take form when people chose to see differently. And she noticed the small changes, the way someone paused before speaking, the way another checked a detail twice instead of once, the way attention had replaced certainty. And those changes mattered more than the system itself, because they were the foundation of what would come next. And Richard turned toward her again, his expression thoughtful, carrying a quiet respect that had not been there before. And he said, "You did more than solve a problem." And he paused briefly, not for effect, but because the words required precision. "You showed us how to think." And Ava held his gaze, her expression steady, not dismissing the statement, but not claiming it either. And she answered simply, "You already knew how." And the response redirected the credit once more, not as deflection, but as truth, because the ability had always been there. It had just been overlooked, and that understanding settled into the room with a quiet weight, reinforcing the shift that had begun. And one of the executives, who had remained silent for most of the meeting, spoke now with a tone that carried reflection. "We stopped asking questions," he admitted, and no one disagreed. Because the statement did not accuse, it clarified, and Richard nodded slightly, absorbing it. And then he looked back at Ava, his voice softer now, but grounded in something more lasting. "You reminded us to start again." And the simplicity of the statement carried more meaning than any formal recognition could, and Ava gave a small nod, not as agreement, but as acknowledgement, as if the moment had reached its natural conclusion, and she took a step back, her hand moving to her notebook once more, holding it lightly, the same way she had when she first entered, and for a brief moment, the room grew still again, not out of tension, but out of awareness, because everyone present understood that something important was ending. Not the work, not the changes that would follow, but the moment itself. The moment where everything shifted, and Richard watched her as she turned toward the door. Again, this time not stopping her, not calling her back, because he understood that what needed to stay was already there, not in her presence, but in what she had changed. And as she reached the door, the system behind her continued to run, stable, steady, no longer hiding anything. And for the first time since the crisis began, the room did not feel like a place of pressure. It felt like a place of possibility, shaped not by control, but by clarity, and Ava stepped forward, carrying nothing more than her notebook, but leaving behind something far greater, a way of seeing that would not be easily forgotten. The door closed softly behind Ava Johnson, not with a sound that demanded attention, but with one that marked a quiet ending. And for a moment, no one in the boardroom spoke, not because there was nothing left to say, but because what had just happened did not need immediate words. It needed to settle, to take shape in a way that would last beyond the moment itself. And Richard Cole remained standing where he was, his eyes still on the door long after it had shut, as if part of him was still, following the small figure who had walked in unnoticed and left undeniable. And the room behind him continued to move, screens updating, voices exchanging information, systems stabilizing fully now, the crisis no longer active but recorded, understood, contained, and yet none of that felt like the real outcome anymore, because what lingered was not the recovery of numbers, but the shift in perspective that had made that recovery possible. And Richard finally turned back to the table, his gaze moving across each person present, not assessing performance, not assigning responsibility, but recognizing something new, something that had been missing and was now visible. And he said quietly, "We almost lost everything," not as a statement of fear, but as a reminder of proximity, of how close they had come to a failure they did not fully understand. And one of the executives nodded slowly, his voice low, reflective, and we did not see it. And the admission did not weaken the room. It grounded it, because truth, once accepted, no longer needed to be defended. And Richard placed his hand lightly on the table, not to steady himself, but to anchor the moment. And he added, "Not because it was hidden, but because we stopped looking." And that distinction settled deeply, because it shifted the responsibility from circumstance to choice. And the room understood that, not as blame, but as clarity, and the analysts continued documenting everything, not just the failure points, but the gaps in thinking that had allowed those points to exist, their work now shaped by awareness instead of assumption. And one of them paused briefly, glancing toward the door, then back to his screen, as if carrying forward the lesson without needing to speak it aloud. And Richard moved to the head of the table once more, but he did not sit immediately. Instead, he stood there, looking at the place where Ava had set her notebook earlier, the faint impression still visible in his mind, if not on the polished surface. And he said, more firmly now, "From this point on, no system runs without question," his voice steady, carrying not just authority, but intention. And no voice is dismissed because it does not fit the room. And the words did not echo. They settled, because they were not meant to impress. They were meant to remain. And the room absorbed them in silence, not out of hesitation, but out of agreement, because what had happened could not be undone. And more importantly, it should not be forgotten. And Richard finally took his seat, not as a return to normal, but as the beginning of something different, his posture relaxed but focused, his gaze clearer than it had been at the start of the meeting. And the system reports continued to confirm stability, every metric holding, every alert resolved, but those confirmations felt secondary now, because the real stability had shifted inward, into the way the room thought, the way it would move forward, and for a brief moment, Richard allowed himself to reflect, not on the crisis, but on the girl who had walked in without introduction, who had spoken only when necessary, and who had left behind something that could not be measured in numbers. And he said quietly, almost to himself, but loud enough to be heard, "She did not change the system." And he paused just long enough for the room to listen. "She changed us." And no one responded, not because they disagreed, but because there was nothing to add, and outside the glass walls, the city continued its rhythm, unaware of the moment that had just passed, while inside, something quieter, stronger, had taken root, and though Ava Johnson was no longer in the room, her presence remained, not as memory, but as a standard, one that would shape every decision that followed, long after the door had closed.